I am Sloane Hart, 35, and tonight I walk my parents and my brother into Crown and Cedar for my father's birthday with a plan to say very little and let the room speak for me. 2 steps in, my brother hisses that this table is not for the poor, and a breath later the floor manager greets me by name and welcomes me back to my usual table, while my father stops mid-sip and the bistro goes still. I have receipts tucked in quiet places, a ledger that tells its own story, and a rule I will not bend because kindness is policy in my house. Before dessert, someone will learn how far grace reaches, and where it ends, a door will close and another will open, and the difference between having a name and having standards will be said on linen. What would you do if your worth was questioned at your own table? And how do you draw a boundary without raising your voice? Stay with me, because by the time the candles burn low, the truth will take its seat, and the promise I made to the people who wear aprons will hold. I felt the cool Austin night slip off my shoulders as the door to Crown and Cedar closed behind us. It was October of 2025 and my father's birthday. Downtown hummed outside, but inside the bistro, the air held that soft hush of linen and glass and practice choreography. Simone the maitre d' lifted her eyes with the measured warmth of a professional who recognizes a face and also the posture of a night that might turn delicate. My father Rick walked ahead with the slow certainty of a man who prefers to be seated rather than shown. My mother Helen adjusted the strap of her handbag as if balance lived there, and Grant hovered at my side, hungry to be taller than he was. The light cut across polished walnut, a river of windows threw back the city in fragments, and somewhere toward the kitchen, a line cook cracked a pan with the authority of flame. We were 2 steps inside when Grant leaned on his words and let them spill. This table isn't for the poor. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He wanted the sentence to work like a pin pressed into cloth. Rick lifted the wine list and then paused mid-sip of water, a tremor in the crystal that caught a shard of light. The room contracted. Not by much. Just enough for me to feel the eyes that always find a family when one member forgets to be kind. Simone's smile did not falter as she gestured toward the center of the dining room. Then Noah Reyes arrived from the floor, the front of the house manager, with the easy shoulders of someone who can settle a room with a breath. "Welcome back, Ms. Hart. Your usual table." His voice was pitched to carry to us, and no farther. He leaned a fraction closer, a stage whisper shaped like courtesy. "We will have everything ready for the owner." The ripple was small, but it traveled. A couple at the banquet went still. A server with a tray steadied her hand in the air. Rick's glass tipped and righted. Helen's eyes lifted to mine as if her question might rise and fall on the surface between us. Grant blinked once like someone stepping from bright sun into shade. I smiled at Noah and said I appreciate it, and Simone met my glance with a nod that read, as yes, we will hold the standard. The 4 of us followed, and I walked the last steps beside my mother. I pulled out her chair. Her fingers brushed mine in a quiet thank you we have used all my life. The tablecloth was so white it seemed to float. I set my phone face down as a promise to myself that this would be about presence. Noah placed menus with the quiet economy I value. The stemware held its own little moons. I could hear the kitchen settle into its rhythmic conversation, and the low heartbeat of the room returned. I kept my voice level. "We are here to celebrate," I said to Noah. "Please bring the tasting menu this evening. And for the wine, I would like the 1990 Chateau Margaux." He inclined his head, and I added that I would be taking care of dinner and that I wanted everything handled the same way it is for every guest. He understood without a flicker. Simone moved away to adjust the pacing with the kitchen, her hand drawing a simple line in the air that meant course timing and corners smoothed. Grant lifted a brow at my dress, a black column with nothing to say for itself. He liked clothes with declarations. Cufflinks you could spot from across the table. He rested his wrists on the linen and studied me like a puzzle that insulted him by solving itself. I let the quiet work. Service would say what needed to be said. The first course arrived with its own hush. A small plate that announced the evening without shouting. Rick looked at it as if it might explain how we had arrived at this precise arrangement of food and history. Helen inhaled and sat a little straighter. I tasted, closed my eyes a second, and let the flavors land where they were meant to. I have built my life around those landings. Noah returned to refresh water. He checked in the way a true professional does, eyes on the table, sensing temperature as much as needed. He addressed my father with respect and my mother with care, and when he stepped back, he left a calm behind him that was almost visible. I kept my hands folded and let my mind walk the timeline it always traces in moments like this. Austin, and then Ithaca, and then back to Austin. A company in 2018, a rescue in 2020, when Crown and Cedar needed a spine and a heartbeat, both nights on a prep stool with a ledger in my lap and a line cook's stories in my ear. The soft pleasure of seeing a system work because people are paid, trained, protected. The dress on my shoulders is from a tiny atelier that never advertises. The car I drove here could be outshone by any valet line in the city. I choose where the shine goes. Grant shifted and tried to reclaim the air. So this is your usual table. He let the words sit. I met his gaze and did not answer. The answer was in Simone's hand on the back of a chair in Noah's glance at the corner. To cue the next course in the kitchen bell that sang once and only once. My father set down his glass and studied me with a calculation I recognized. He was measuring a landscape he did not map. My mother tucked a wisp of hair behind her ear and found a smile to set between us that meant, let us not lose the night we came to have. The room rounded back into its own rhythm. Someone laughed near the window. The windows gave the city back to itself. I placed my napkin flat, felt the weight of linen against my palm, and breathed. There would be time later for everything else. For now, the celebration would move forward one plate at a time, and I would let the service carry the story the way only good service can. I lifted my glass to Helen with a small tilt, and she returned it with that expression that says, I see you even if I do not yet understand the whole of it. I kept my silence and gave the room its job. The first course settled between us like a quiet announcement, and the room found its breath again. A silver spoon rested at the edge of my plate, and the steam from a small bowl curled and disappeared. I tasted and let the flavors speak while my father studied the linen as if the weave might offer him a different daughter. Grant sat back, forearms on the table cuffs, catching the light, the practiced smirk hovering and waiting for an audience. I told myself to keep the edges soft, and then I stepped into the memory that never quite leaves. I reminded my parents of the afternoon a decade ago when I put down a finance recruiting packet on the kitchen island and said I was choosing restaurants. My mother's hand went to her handbag strap as if the leather could steady her. My father set his water down without meeting my eyes. That was the day he decided that hospitality was a hobby and that I would grow out of it once a real offer appeared. I remember the sound of the refrigerator cycling on and the way my own voice did not shake. The path after that looked simple on paper and complicated in practice. I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in the year 2012, a diploma I earned with morning shifts and late-night study groups, and a part-time hostess job that taught me how a dining room breathes. 4 years later, I finished my MBA at Cornell, not because I needed more letters, but because I wanted to understand systems that hold under pressure. In the year 2018, I formed Oak and Ember Hospitality Group with a laptop, a notebook of service maps, and a clean apron. By the spring of 2020, I took over Crown and Cedar when its lights were flickering and its books were thin. I did not come in with fireworks. I came in with training calendars and a promise that paychecks would be right and on time. Minimal looked different on me than it did on the women my father played golf with. I wore a simple black dress because I liked to hear fabric move, not logos. I drove a car that asked for nothing but gas and maintenance. Every extra dollar I could have worn went instead to line cooks who took the bus before dawn and to hosts who knew how to read a room. It felt less like sacrifice and more like alignment. The people who built the spine of this place made the rest possible. Simone anchored the front with a calm eye and a way of opening the room so that guests felt invited and not displayed. Noah carried the weight of the floor, sensing a table before it spoke, watching the tide of service and setting the pace. In the kitchen, Chef Avery Murray arrived in the year 2021 with sleeves rolled and a mind that balanced season and restraint. She spoke in verbs, braise and rest and finish, and the plates listened. Philippe Laurent, who knows how old wines tell time, shaped the cellar into a conversation with the menu. None of them needed to stand in a spotlight. They made the light behave. I watched my father toy with a corner of the napkin and pretend to be interested in the pattern of the carpet. He had made a life out of evaluating risk and return. He could spot a shaky balance sheet from across a conference table. What he could not calculate was the thing that keeps a dining room together. It is not a ratio or yield. It is the quiet discipline of people who care about their shift and about one another. Grant cleared his throat and adjusted his cufflinks again. He liked to move his hands when attention drifted away, a little motion to pull the gaze back. He glanced toward the bar where a couple laughed and then back at me, searching for somewhere to place the old joke about my tiny apartment and my thrift store shoes. I felt the old sting rise and fall, then I let it go. Tonight did not need that fight. Tonight I needed patience. The second course approached and retreated in a small choreography of trays and nods. Simone checked the pacing with the kitchen. Noah refreshed my mother's water with a quiet that made the gesture feel like respect rather than service. My mother found my eyes and asked with a look if I remembered our college tour through Austin in the spring before graduation. I nodded. I remembered more than she knew. I remembered the way she squeezed my hand when a professor said that hospitality done well is a study in empathy. I told them that choosing this life was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of recognition. I like the way a room picks up when staff stand a little taller because someone invested in their training. I liked honest margins and clean books and a crew that knows what the word standard means. I like the feeling of opening a door and seeing a line cook grin because the prep station is stocked and labeled and the knives are sharp. My father finally looked up. There was a calculation in his eyes that softened at the edges and then firmed again. He was trying to fit this version of me into the old outline he drew when I was 20. He could not make the lines meet. He set his fork down and said that he wanted the evening to be pleasant. I thanked him for that and let the room resume its job. Grant leaned forward just enough to suggest that the conversation should return to him. He asked if the menu had changed much since the last time he had been here. I said that menus change because seasons do, and that he should enjoy what arrived. He settled back slightly thwarted and studied his reflection in the curve of a spoon. The tempo of the dining room ticked one notch brighter, then leveled. Plates lifted and landed. A server laughed under her breath and was gone. I did not need to push. I had already put the memory on the table and watched my mother tighten her grip on the past for a beat and then loosen it. That was enough movement for one course. When the next plate touched linen and the aroma reached us, I rested my hands and let the moment settle exactly where it should. The second plate carried a clean brightness that reset the table, and for a few breaths, the only conversation was knife-through texture and the sigh of linen when someone shifted in a chair. Grant let his gaze slide down my dress and let a small sound hang in the air, something between a laugh and a sniff. He wanted me to feel the small inside fabric that did not announce a label. I set my fork down and lifted my water, gave him a patient look, and then I pointed not with a finger but with the way the room was moving. I told him that what he was seeing was the point. I said that there was a reason the first two courses had arrived inside the same small window, that the pacing felt like breath, and not like a rush. Raj Patel built a seating dashboard that lives on the screen at the host stand, a simple grid that predicts when a table will open and where a party should land. It keeps our wait under 10 minutes even on a Friday, with rain coming in sheets and a line at the door. The grid is not flashy. It is accurate. That is why Simone can accept a walk-in without breaking the rhythm, and why Noah knows when to take one extra step and when to let the room rest. Grant shifted and adjusted his cufflinks, the light catching on the metal, as if it wanted his attention as much as he wanted mine. He said that all of this sounded like luck wrapped in a story. I smiled and told him that luck did not iron napkins or teach a server to sidestep without clipping a chair. Teresa Nguyen made sure that every person in the front of the house earns at least $20 an hour and has benefits, and that is why the same faces return shift after shift. Consistency is not a speech. It is a paycheck that clears a schedule that respects a life a manager who steps in when a guest crosses a line. That is why Noah saw my mother reach for her water before she realized the glass was low, and why he was already there. Rick touched the stem of his glass and watched me the way he watches a market he does not have a position in anymore. Helen moved her purse strap a notch and let her shoulders release by an inch. She knows the difference between posture and peace. I could feel the table descend into the kind of quiet that lets words land. Grant tried another angle and asked if the math ever made sense. He said he had friends who noticed that I never seemed to buy anything out loud, and that maybe that meant I was conserving because the business was thin. I told him that Jordan Park counts the cash before the story, and that is why there are no cinnamon-scented candles burning money in the restroom and no art bought for bragging rights. There are clean books and vendors paid on the terms we promised, and training classes that do not get canceled when the weather turns. That discipline is why a bottle like the one Philippe is about to open is a celebration and not a cover. Noah returned without a sound, checked the table with that orbital gaze he has, and then stepped away. Simone followed with a tray and a quiet smile, set down fresh cutlery in a pattern that telegraphed the next course, and gave me a look that said, "The kitchen is ready when you are." I nodded once and let the subtle choreography do its work. Grant leaned back and tried to find the old joke about my apartment, the one about tiny rooms and thrift furniture. I told him that we seat kindness and reservations, not last names. The sentence did not need a flourish. It settled like a small stone in a shallow bowl. He opened his mouth and then closed it, fingers returning to those cuffs, as if they could rescue him from his own habit. My father finally spoke and said that it seemed I had systems. He said it in the tone of a man admitting the existence of a mountain when he had planned on a hill. I said that systems are simply promises written down and kept, and that you can taste a promise when it shows up on time and at the right temperature. Helen smiled at that small and real. I let the room keep teaching. A server drifted past with a tray high and a wrist steady. 2 stops by the window finished, and the bus driver arrived as if he had been waiting just outside the frame. No clatter, no rush, a swift reset that looked like water returning to a glass. The host stand light blinked, and I knew without looking that Raj's grid had turned another square from red to green. The wait would hold under 10 minutes and nobody would feel hurried. Grant gave up the smirk for a minute and studied the plate in front of him as if it might hold a better line than the one he had tried. He finally said that the food was good. I said that good is the floor we stand on, and then I thanked the server when she cleared because gratitude taught out loud has a way of multiplying. Simone slipped in, lifted our cutlery with a soft clink, and set down the new set for the course that was waiting in the pass. The table grew quieter, not with tension but with attention. Even Grant felt it. I rested my palms on the linen and let the next space open in front of us. Noah glided back with that quiet presence that makes a room behave. He checked the table, read our faces, and then he leaned just close enough to be discreet. He said the wait list tonight was fully committed. He offered the bar as a comfortable place to wait if we wanted a different section once a window table turned. He kept his tone friendly, professional, and neutral, the way the best managers do when they protect both policy and dignity. Grant had been eyeing the corner banquette since we sat down. He lifted his chin now, ready to test the perimeter. He asked if the heart name might help. The word carried farther than he expected. A couple at the next table went quiet in that attentive way people do when privilege steps into a conversation that did not invite it. A server crossing behind us slowed half a step. Color rose into Grant's cheeks, the kind that looks like heat and feels like exposure. Noah did not flinch. He assured us the team would honor reservations in the order they were made. He suggested the bar again with a small smile and promised to keep an eye on timing. Then he stepped away as if nothing unusual had happened, and somehow the room followed his lead. My mother lifted her water and found my gaze over the rim. She wanted the evening back. I had the same wish, though I knew the only way there was through. In my mind, I saw the winter night at the Gilded Fox in New York, when Grant tried a similar trick. A line wrapped along the foyer collars up breath-turning white near the door. He approached the host stand, said our last name like a key, and waited for the lock to click. Simone was on a training trip that week. She stood beside the host and let the moment breathe. She explained the list. She offered the bar. She wrote his phone number on the wait card and promised a text. No one raised a voice. The room did not bend. Later, over a plate of olives, Grant told me the city had become unfriendly. I said the city had become consistent. Back in Austin, Simone approached our table now with a soft steadiness that read as respect. She told us the dining room would honor all reservations as scheduled. There was no judgment in her voice. It was information delivered clean, like a plate set down without a single clink against china. Helen nodded quickly and asked that we continue with dinner. Her words were gentle, as if a small stitch could close a widening seam. Grant adjusted his cufflinks again, the silver catching a shallow line of light, and focused on his knife as if it had given him a task. Rick pretended to study the wine label. He has always used detail as a shelter. I felt that familiar urge to teach, float up, then I let it pass. I did not repeat the line about kindness and reservations. The room had already said it for me. Noah had said it by keeping policy soft and firm at once. Simone had said it by making fairness sound like the most natural thing in the world. The guests nearby had said it with their quiet attention, a kind of social reminder that restaurants are small democracies, holding the evening together one table at a time. The third course arrived exactly when it should. The server set plates in a clean arc and lifted cloches with a small updraft of aroma. You could hear the table find its appetite again. The sound of forks returned light and regular, like a tide coming back after a momentary hold. Grant took a bite and let the flavor argue with his mood. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He asked if the kitchen always runs this tight. I said Chef Avery builds her menu like a conversation where no one interrupts. She cooks with restraint, because restraint lets the ingredients speak. He nodded, not eager to agree, but unable to deny what his mouth already knew. Helen rested a hand near my forearm, not quite touching a permission to choose peace. I breathed with it. Rick cleared his throat and said something about the seasoning that did not need an answer. He wanted to remain a consumer in this room, not a student. That was fine. Guests are allowed to be guests. I watched Noah cross to a four-top by the windows. He bent slightly to the eldest woman at that table, listened, then adjusted a chair so she would have more room. She smiled in a way that undid a small knot inside me. This is why we build policy and protect it. It is not to make a point. It is to make it easier. Grant kept his eyes down and ate. A nearby couple resumed their own conversation. The small hush that had gathered drifted off, and the bistro retook its hum. Simone passed behind me and set fresh cutlery with a whisper of metal on linen. She did not need me to approve. She needed me to let the system do the work I hired it to do. I looked at my family, at the man who taught me how to present a spreadsheet, and the woman who taught me how to read a room, at the brother who had never noticed the invisible hands that carry a night. Then I looked at the plate in front of me and let the lesson land without a speech. The fork in my hand felt steady. The room was back to its balance. We could eat now. We could let this course speak and save the rest for later. The room held steady for 3 breaths before Simone appeared at my shoulder and asked to borrow me for a moment at the host stand. I rose and followed her along the windows where the city floated in dark glass. The stand glowed with its soft screen rage grid, turning small squares from red to green as tables flipped. Selena Ortiz was waiting there. 48 precise suit, calm eyes, the kind of presence that steadies a floor without a single raised word. She handed me a slim envelope. Inside were printed pages with timestamps lined up like a metronome. On top sat a short summary from Lila Chen. Lila had pulled the posting pattern of an anonymous account that had started smearing Crown and Cedar last week. The account claimed careless service and hinted at food safety issues that were not only false but designed to rattle guests who do not know us yet. Raj had overlaid those timestamps with publicly visible check-ins and location tags from a group of regulars at Westfield Athletic Club friends that Grant often meets on Thursdays. The first post went live while the group was still at the club. The next one hit 5 minutes after a rideshare ping placed the same phone 2 blocks from our door. A third arrived at the precise minute the party walked past our windows. The cadence was too clean to be random noise. Selena said the preservation requests were already in motion, and a cease and desist was drafted and ready to send to the platform, and once we had the subscriber details to the account holder as well. She was not looking to make a scene inside my dining room. She was looking to protect a house that runs on care. Her tone was even and professional, like linen laid flat. I read the top page. The facts were clear. I asked if she needed anything from me to proceed under policy. She said a simple confirmation would be enough for tonight. I nodded and closed the envelope. The paper sounded like a small door closing in a quiet hallway. Simone touched my elbow, and we walked back to the table. I could feel eyes soft on us and then away again. It is a particular skill in fine dining, the way a room learns to pretend not to notice what does not concern it. I sat. My father Rick watched me with that banker caution that measures weather before moving money. My mother Helen adjusted the strap of her handbag and found my face as if reassurance could be passed by glance alone. Grant rested his forearms on the linen cufflinks polished to a small flash expression set to neutral like a screen that hides another window. I kept my voice low and steady and asked Grant if there was anything he wished to retract. The question slid into the space between us and settled there without heat. He blinked, took up his water, set it down again without drinking. He asked what I meant, but even he could hear there was no air in it. The envelope lay against my palm under the table, a small weight that reminded me I did not need volume to have authority. I lifted my eyes toward the host stand. Selena met my glance. I gave a single nod that said, "Handle per policy." She returned a smaller one and disappeared into the hush like a stone into water. Philippe approached with a decanter. He cradled the neck in his hand and let the wine breathe. He did not narrate. He did not have to. He poured a measured taste for me and a respectful measure for my father, and then rested the bottle in its cradle. The soft click of glass on wood sounded like a period. Grant tried on a smile and could not find the fit. He said people say things online and that nothing can really be done about it. I agreed with the part that is true. The rest I left where it belonged. We keep receipts. We follow the process. We do not raise our voice while a server is in motion. Helen asked if we might enjoy the next course. She said it gently, like someone coaxing a cat out from under a bed. I told her that sounded perfect. Rick lifted his glass, studied the color, and put it down again. His silence was not dismissed this time. It was a consideration. The hum of the room reasserted itself first near the bar, and then along the windows where the two-top leaned into a private laugh. Noah passed behind me and topped off the waters with that smooth wrist he has. The server from the pass floated in set plates and slipped away. A couple at the banquet glanced toward us and then back to their own small world the way good guests do when they trust a house to mind its business. Grant looked from me to the host stand and back again. He asked if I was really going to pursue this. I told him I was going to let policy do its job. He tapped the handle of his knife once and then stopped, as if the sound had told him more than my words. I tasted the wine. It opened like a slow door. For a second, I thought about every night we had built toward this. The training calendars, the meetings that ran 5 minutes long, because someone needed to be heard, the staff meals cooked by a line cook who wants to be a sous chef in a year. The envelope rested beside my plate, and I let its weight remind me that strength is quiet until it is not. Simone returned with new cutlery and a small nod that told me the pacing was on track. I let a breath leave, and I let the room take back the evening. The silence at our table grew heavier by a hair, not oppressive, just present the way a storm is present long before the first drop. When the server lowered the next course to the linen and the aroma rose, I picked up my fork and chose calm again. Philippe approached with the quiet certainty of a man who has shepherded 1,000 dining rooms through 1,000 small storms. He paused at my shoulder and spoke in a tone only the table could catch. A representative from Northbridge Capital had sent over a burgundy from the bar and asked whether I might accept the gesture. The air at our foretop drew in by a fraction. I felt Rick shift in his chair, Helen straighten. Grant tip his chin as if a new audience had arrived. I met Philippe's eyes and asked him to return a warm thanks and decline, and to let their party know that I was happy to schedule time after service. He inclined his head and moved away, carrying my answer like a tray set high so it would not spill. Grant recovered first and tried to turn the moment into a tease. I let his words pass without catching them. Rick studied my face with a caution that had loosened since the first course. He looked not at my dress or my hands, but at the steadiness he could not account for on a spreadsheet. Helen reached for her water and then rested her palm flat on the linen as if grounding herself in the honesty of fabric. The room returned to its hum, and I let my mind touch the memory I had kept measured these last months. In July of this year, Victor Hale from Northbridge laid out an offer to buy the company at 12 times trailing earnings. The number was designed to make decision-making feel like gravity. He spoke about scale and roll-ups and liquidity events, and I nodded because listening is free. Then I told him I could not sell the culture we had built, not at that price, and not at any price I had seen, because culture is not inventory, and it does not transfer cleanly on paper. He said that sentiment was admirable and that shareholders appreciate discipline. I thanked him for the conversation and walked out into the heat that shimmered above the sidewalk. The kind that reminds you a season has its own mind. A week ago, the same firm circled back with a softer touch. They suggested alternative structures, minority stakes, advisory roles, language meant to lower the temperature without changing the recipe. Jordan Park and I took the call in the conference room above the dining room after the staff meal, the two of us with coffee gone cool, and a legal pad full of quiet no's. We pulled out the operating agreement, the version we signed. When Oak and Ember left the napkin stage and became a company, we read again the section that grants our right of first refusal, the clause that lets us choose our future before anyone else decides it for us. We discussed the plan I had been sketching for months to roll out an employee stock ownership program at 12% of the company, a structure that would tie reward to the same hands that lace aprons and stand the line and reset glassware until it shines. Jordan tapped his pen and said that sometimes the smartest growth is the kind that pays your people first. I told him I was not in the business of selling a story and then forgetting the characters. Back at the table, the server set down the next course and the aroma lifted in a small ribbon between us. Philippe returned without the burgundy, and with a note in his pocket that I knew would hold a business card and a request to connect. He did not place it on the table. He held it for later, which is why I trust him with my dining room and my message at the same time. Noah read the room from 3 tables away and adjusted pacing with a glance toward the pass. Simone floated by and aligned the stemware by a 1/4 inch, a gesture that told me the floor was balanced. Rick cleared his throat and asked in his careful way whether conversations like the one at the bar happened often. I told him they come in waves, that the capital looks for good houses to live in and that it is flattering when they knock. He nodded once and did not press. Respect was entering the space between us like a draft of cooler air. Grant tried to measure the moment and then asked if refusing meant I was afraid of scrutiny. I let the question sit where it fell. Fear does not hire a general counsel and an HR director who enforce policies even on a holiday week. Fear does not write a right of first refusal into an agreement when it would have been easier to leave it to chance. Fear does not plan an employee ownership program and open the books in a way that teaches rather than hides. I told him that what I am building is not a bet on secrecy. It is a commitment to a way of working that holds. When the room fills, the phones ring, and the internet throws a tantrum. He looked away first. Philippe slid a fresh pour into Rick's glass and stepped back to neutral. The Margot lifted and settled. Helen smiled at nothing in particular, and then at me, a small lift that I understood as permission to be exactly who I am at my own table. The night found its rhythm again. Cutlery lifted and set. Water moved in quiet arcs. The offer at the bar would wait in its envelope of polite intent. My answer had already been delivered. I picked up my fork and tasted what Avery had sent from the pass. The flavors were clean and intentional, like sentences without extra words. Rick watched my face, then the plate, then my face again. Something in his eyes shifted by a degree I could not name and did not need to. Respect rarely arrives with fireworks. It slips into a room and takes a seat. Outside the windows, Austin kept its neon steady. Inside, the service was held. I let the course be what it was and set the rest where it belonged in the quiet ledger I keep. My phone hummed once on the linen, and I tipped the screen toward my lap. Imogen Clark had sent a short video from Mayfair, a quick sweep of our dining room there at evening service. The room looked like a held breath. You could see the council inspector in the corner nod once, and you could hear nothing else. Beneath the clip, her note confirmed the winter noise conditions had been extended, and that the neighborhood board had signed off without a single objection. 90 days of waitlist that began back in September of last year were still full for a season that started with our March soft open and never loosened. I felt a small current go through me. Not pride in the noisy way, more the quiet satisfaction of a door that closes with a clean latch. A moment later, Avery sent out 2 plates from the London menu. She did not announce them. She let the plates speak. On one was a fillet that looked like the Thames at dusk, a pearl of sauce catching light and then letting it go. On the other was a winter salad that felt like a whisper bitter and sweet standing side by side without crowding. Simone set fresh cutlery and stepped back. I tasted each and thought of the narrow streets near our Mayfair corner, how sound lives differently there, and how we learned the language of quiet service so the neighborhood would let us belong. Grant pulled out his phone with the lazy confidence of a man who believes in shortcuts. He opened the reservation app and tapped Mayfair House. The screen blinked and returned a gentle line that told him the waitlist remained at capacity. His mouth held a question and then tucked it away. He scrolled once more and tried a different date and met the same soft wall. Rick watched him without comment and let his glass turn a slow half circle on the linen. Noah refreshed my mother's water and adjusted the candle so the light fell easy across her face. Helen smiled at the plates and then at me, the way mothers smile when they do not have the vocabulary, but they have the feeling. I nodded and kept the room's tempo in my pulse. Another buzz crossed the table, this one from Teresa Nguyen. She had been tracking the anonymous complaint that tried to rattle our kitchen last week. Her message was short. The health department had closed the file. Crown and Cedar had earned an A. Documentation logged. I leaned back a fraction and let my lungs fill. There is a particular relief in a system clearing its own throat. I sent back a quick acknowledgement and set the phone face down. As if the house could read the air, a server passed by and a busser followed with the exact towel he needed. The floor moved like a river, one current under another. Simone caught my eye. Her look said we saw it through. I gave a small nod and let the plates do the talking. A young line server hesitated by the host stand and then drifted close enough to be heard only by me. He had that earnest gravity new professionals get when they are not sure if they should carry a pebble of news or leave it where it lies. He mentioned that a name tied to the complaint had shown up in an old guest list from the club where Grant often spends Thursday evenings. He did not say more. He did not need to. I thanked him with my eyes and with the kind of smile that does not invite gossip. Information belongs in process, not in a room. Grant set his phone down and reached for the London salad. He took a bite and made a small sound that might have been approved. He asked if the council there was always this agreeable. I said that the council had been exacting and fair, and that we had listened carefully, built a service that keeps sound where it should be, and invited neighbors in before we asked them to accept us. He chewed slowly and took another bite. Rick leaned back and watched the room the way a man considers a field he has never planted. Helen asked if the fish was meant to feel like silk. I told her yes, that Avery cooks in sentences without extra words. She smiled and kept eating. Noah made a small adjustment to pacing, and the next table relaxed at the same time ours did. Philippe checked his cellar watch and moved toward the sideboard, the arc of his shoulders saying he knew exactly when to approach and when to leave a table to its own peace. The bistro's hum returned to steady, and I felt that privacy the best rooms give their guests the sense that nothing outside the circle of the table matters for a while. I wanted to cheer for the grade and the council and the team that made both possible, but that is not what a good owner does in the middle of service. I reached for my fork instead and thanked Avery when she passed, just a nod in the air as she moved toward the kitchen window. Noah caught it and met it with a small salute that looked like a breath. Grant took a last look at his phone, turned it face down and folded his hands. The room settled another inch. I kept my voice quiet and asked if everyone was ready for the next plate. Rick said that he was, and that the London fish tasted like a clear thought. Helen laughed softly and agreed. Grant said nothing and reached for his glass. The candles flickered a little as the door opened to let in 2 new coats and then fell still. I let the moment join the ledger of this night and gave the floor back to the plates and the people who carry them. My phone rested where the candlelight could not catch it. A soft vibration slid under my palm. Kenji Morita had sent the draft of the master franchise agreement for Tokyo. I opened the file and felt the room keep breathing around me. The clauses stacked in calm language until one line lifted like a wire across a path. The quality control and quality assurance provision gave the local operator final say in deviations for supply and training once certain thresholds were met. It read reasonably. It was not. If I signed it that way, Oak and Ember would surrender a veto that protects the way a guest is treated before they even sit down. I flagged the section and forwarded it to Selena. She replied from her seat near the host stand. She had already marked the same paragraph in red and added a note that we would need a retained right to approve any material change to training, sourcing, recipe flow, service timing, and brand standards. She added that the dispute resolution language needed a window that allowed us to pull the brand if non-compliance persisted. Her message was quiet law in plain clothes. I felt steadier reading it. I sent Kenji a short note. I thanked him for turning the draft quickly after the letter of intent we signed in May. I told him we were prepared to move at the pace that keeps the standard intact, and that if that meant slow, then slow is a good word. I set the phone face down and looked up into the room that has taught me patience, one plate at a time. Rick watched me with the attention of a man learning a new instrument. He asked in his careful way how a letter of intent is different from what I was reading now. I told him the letter is a handshake written down. It says we plan to work together, and here is the outline. The contract is the house we will live in. It says which doors lock and who holds the keys. He nodded once and let his gaze drop to the table, as if he could see the floor plan between salt and glass. The salmon course arrived, then a quiet forest of color on white. Avery cooks fish like a sentence that knows where it is going. The flesh gave under the fork and held its dignity. Helen tasted and smiled. She asked why not move fast when a city is ready to welcome us. I said that some doors look open and are only painted that way. I told her that speed without control feels like applause with no music. In the kitchen there are people who put their names on every plate. They stand on tile for 10 hours, bind sauces, check temperatures, and send food into the world with their reputation tucked into it. I owe them the time it takes to keep that promise whole. Grant watched this exchange as if it were a sport he did not play. He tried to find a line about lost opportunity and then let it go. Noah refreshed the waters and adjusted the candle so the flame sat lower. Simone passed by and gave me a glance that said the pacing was in our hands. The dining room returned to its hum. The door opened and closed. Coats found hooks. Conversations bent toward dessert and late shows, and a game on a screen somewhere down the block. I let the taste of the fish settle, and then told Rick that control is not cosmetic. It is not about whether the napkin folds into a triangle or a square. It is about whether a guest in Tokyo will feel the same welcome as a guest in Austin. It is about a line cook hearing the same clock in their head when they rest meat or pull stock from the simmer. It is about a manager stepping in when a guest crosses a line and doing it with grace and authority, because the policy is more than paper. He listened, and for a moment, he did not look like a banker. He looked like a father who understood that a life has a shape only its owner can recognize. Selena moved near our table and paused until my eyes met hers. She had already drafted language that restored our veto on quality. She mouthed a single word that read as solvable. I felt something in my chest untie. I nodded and returned to my plate. Helen touched the edge of her napkin and said that she liked the way the fish did not brag. She said it felt like confidence. I told her that is the point of a standard. It lets the food speak without decoration. She smiled in that small way she has when a thought lands and does not need to be said again. Grant pushed his fork through the last bite and examined the tines as if they might reveal a faster path. He has always believed in a shortcut that will finally present itself if he looks at the map long enough. The room kept teaching him with its patience. He did not notice. That is all right. Some lessons sit and wait until you're ready to see them. I checked the screen once more. Kenji had sent a polite acknowledgement. He would confer with his counsel in the morning. He appreciated our clarity. He suggested a call after the weekend. I thanked him and closed the file. Then I let the candle reflect in the glass until it became a second flame. Noah lifted his eyes from 3 tables away and gave the smallest nod. Service was on time. The next course was ready when we were. I placed my fork down and let this chapter of the evening rest beside it. The next lull arrived like a soft landing and my father used it. He folded his hands on the linen and said he had something to put on the table. He spoke in that low, measured tone he saves for confessions he believes are actually explanations. He told me that in the year 2017, he amended the revocable trust and reduced my share because he was convinced hospitality was a dead end. He said he had thought it would nudge me toward a sensible path and that time had slipped and he had not revisited the documents. He looked tired at the edge of the eyes and older in a way I had not noticed when we walked in. I let the words find their place between us. Then I told him that I would not sue. I said that I understand what a revocable trust is and that the law allows him to arrange his estate as he believes wise. I said that I am building my own legacy and that the way I protect myself is not through court but through work and the structure I make around it. The relief on his face was small and real, and then he braced for the rest. Helen set her hand flat near her water, as if to steady the table. Her voice came out carefully. She said that she had listened to friends around golf tournament lunches and fundraisers for years, and let their opinions dress up as truth. She said she was sorry that she had believed the chatter about respectable careers and childish pursuits. She said she had let other people narrate her daughter and she wanted to hand that job back. Moisture gathered at the corners of her eyes and she blinked it clear. She is not a woman who weeps for the audience. She was telling me where her compass had failed. I told them what I had already set in motion. I am establishing a scholarship in my mother's name at the community college that feeds so many of our kitchens. It will pay tuition and tools for students who choose culinary or front of house or beverage studies, and it will come with placement in one of our restaurants and mentoring hours that count as more than paper. It is not a grand gesture. It is a practical path. My mother's name will appear on certificates and coats, and for once the letters will not hang on a gala banner but walk into service on a Tuesday. Grant stared at the candle as if fire might teach him a shortcut. He did not reach for a joke. He did not reach for anything. For the first time all evening, he looked like someone who had run out of the lines he rehearsed. I told my father and mother that I love them and that love does not mean everything counts as acceptable. I said that there are rules in my house and in my life, and that I will not bend them for a last name. I said that name-dropping does not buy you a seat, and disrespecting staff is a hard stop that does not need a second warning. I said that kindness is not a soft skill in our world. It is safety and it is policy, and it is how people keep their shoulders from riding up to their ears when they come to work. The room seemed to hear and not hear at once. The bistro kept its hum. Simone approached with the cheese course and the air shifted a degree warmer. She set down plates with a quiet that respected the moment and then adjusted the pacing with a glance toward the pass. The board carried a small study in texture, a soft blue that did not shout, a firm sheep that asked you to wait a second, a goat that tasted like an idea made simple. Honey and toasted nuts and a slip of fruit balanced the rest. It was a plate that calmed rather than impressed. Rick picked up his fork and set it down again. He told me that when he changed the trust, he had thought he was protecting me from disappointment, and that now it seemed he had been protecting himself from being wrong. He did not ask for absolution. He asked for the chance to pay attention. I said that the chance was free and the work would be the price. Helen lifted a small piece of cheese and smiled. She said that the blue was gentler than she expected. She laughed at the way that sentence stood in for more than cheese, and patted my wrist with fingers that have bandaged knees and zipped dresses and steadied rooms for decades. The heat at the table dropped. The air came back. Noah passed behind me and refilled water with a slight bend at the waist. He placed a new knife for Rick and let his hand rise without touching his shoulder, the gesture that says, "I am here if you need me, and invisible if you do not." Philippe hovered at the edge of our space and read that the moment did not require wine. He melted back to his sideboard with the courtesy of a ghost. Grant asked if the scholarship would carry conditions. I told him that it would carry expectations. Show up. Learn. Treat guests and teammates like human beings. Keep knives sharp and voices even. He nodded once and looked down. I took a bite and let the honey round the salt. The room felt easier. The hard words had been said without breaking anything. A line had been drawn and labeled not with threat, but with clarity. When Helen reached for her glass, our fingers touched and stayed an extra second, and that was the permission we both needed. Simone slipped a clean set of cutlery beside my plate, a signal that the next course could arrive when we were ready. I breathed and let the quiet take the weight for a while. I lifted my glass toward my father and let my smile carry the words, "Happy birthday." The room eased into that soft pause people give a toast even when they cannot quite hear it. I set the glass down and slid my iPad from the side of my chair. The screen bloomed to the ledger I had prepared for tonight. A simple list of checks quietly comped for this table of 4 and sometimes 5 when schedules aligned. Dates and totals, servers, and sections, all of it lined up from November 2024 through October 2025. I angled the screen so the numbers did not feel like a spotlight, only like proof. My father learned first. He scanned with the neat attention of a man who has balanced more sheets than I have candles in my life. He did not reach for a defense. He did not look for a mistake. My mother placed her fingers lightly on the table and watched me rather than the screen. Grant gave the quickest glance and then chose the safety of his own hands, fingers straightening a napkin that did not need straightening. I said that this was my choice. I said it with my face and my breath rather than with a speech. I wanted my family to be fed well wherever my name hangs on a door. I wanted to do it without making a parade. I wanted kindness to be a private language. This is how I was raised at my best, I thought, and this is how I raise a house. Noah appeared at my shoulder with the sense of timing that lives in his bones. I told him I would be covering dinner and that I wanted the check to include the standard gratuity so that the team would be paid as they should be paid. He understood at once. He nodded with that quick warmth that reads as respect rather than relief, and slipped away to set the note on the ticket. It was important to say it now, here in the open air of our table, not for credit, but for clarity. Grant lowered his eyes. The gesture was small and finally real. Helen reached across and touched the back of my hand and let it rest there in a way that said both thank you and please forgive me a little while longer. Rick gave a short nod, the kind he uses when a point lands, and he accepts it, even if the acceptance costs him a story he has told himself for years. From the sideboard, Philippe approached with a decanter the color of old brick after rain. He presented the port without ceremony, checked the temperature, and let a ribbon of 1989 fall into the crystal. The scent rose like memory, dark fruit, and a patience within that patience. He placed a measured pour at my father's right hand, a smaller one at mine, and then let the bottle rest in its cradle as if it had found its bed for the night. The pastry team rolled the dessert cart toward us, wheels quiet on the floor. A tower of small plates. A neat row of spoons that caught the candlelight and passed it along. There was a chocolate souffle sitting in its own gravity, a citrus tart with edges like folded paper, and a dish of Earl Grey custard. I knew had taken half a day of testing to land exactly where it should. The cart stopped with that satisfying alignment only practice can teach. Avery stepped to the edge of the circle of our table. She wore her jacket open, the clean white that never stays perfectly white if you have actually cooked in it. She greeted me with that professional warmth that belongs to a chef who understands a dining room is a partner and not a stage. She said she would love for me to step into the kitchen after dessert to taste a new element for the winter menu. She added that she would have a spare jacket and a fresh cap waiting, and that we would do it properly, hands washed and paths followed, all health code in place. I told her I would be honored and that I would come only when our table had finished eating in peace. She smiled the way chefs do when the pass is running on time and returned to her station with the quiet stride of someone who knows exactly where every flame sits. Helen chose the souffle and watched the spoon break the surface and release a breath of chocolate, as if the dessert itself were relieved to be understood. My father tasted the port and set the glass down carefully. He gave me another of those small nods that are beginning to feel like the currency of this night. Grant took the citrus tart, and for a heartbeat I saw him watch the neat wedge rest on his plate like a lesson in balance. I explained the ledger in a few simple sentences. Not a grand explanation, just the truth. I wanted them to know I had done this because the family feels right when it is unannounced, because my staff deserves to see the owner live the policy she writes, because generosity is only real when it does not ask for an audience. There was no argument across the table. The dessert settled the way good dessert should, sweet without noise, complete without flourish. Noah poured coffee with his steady hand and asked me with a look if the pacing needed adjustment. I shook my head and let the timing breathe. Simone checked the room, aligned a fork, and melted away. The bistro held its perfect hum. I closed the iPad and slid it back beside my chair. The record had done its job. The rest of the evening could be about the food again. Avery caught my eye from the pass, and I gave a small nod that meant later. The kitchen lights held their calm. I took a slow sip of port and let it sit long enough to remember the years it had already lived before reaching this glass. The table felt settled. The night turned toward its next piece, and I led it. Selena appeared at the edge of our table with that courtroom calm she wears like a second skin. She asked with a glance if now was acceptable. I nodded. She said the anonymous account had removed the posts and delivered a written apology. Preservation notices were on file. The platform had acknowledged our request. The temperature around the table dropped a degree the way a room cools when truth finally sits down. I thanked her and asked her to stay within sight for a moment. Grant shifted in his chair. He watched the candle, then the envelope on the chair beside me, then my face, as if each one might change the others. Rick folded his hands. Helen drew in a small breath and waited. I said that in our house, consequences follow behavior. They are not punishments in search of humiliation. They are boundaries drawn so people can work without bracing. I told Grant that effective immediately, he would not be welcome at any Oak and Ember dining room for 6 months. The ban would be lifted only after he asked forgiveness from the team here face to face and completed the training we require for guests who cross lines with staff. The training is titled Zero Tolerance for Guest Harassment. It lives in plain words because plain is hard to misunderstand. Grant opened his mouth and then set his jaw. His hand went to his cufflinks as if polish could solve policy. He stared at the linen and said nothing. Helen touched the rim of her glass and looked at me with a plea I recognized, the one that asks if there is mercy inside the structure. I told her there is. The ban is not forever. The door is not locked. The handle has instructions. Follow them and it opens. Rick asked if this would be recorded. I said yes, that our incident log would reflect the action and the conditions for return. Selena confirmed with a small nod, and said she would deliver notices to the managers across the group before close of business tomorrow. Noah stood a respectful distance away with a soft focus that let privacy hold. He would keep the table steady while the paper caught up. I turned to my parents and invited them to visit the kitchen after dessert if they wished. I reminded them that the kitchen is a workplace and that we would follow health code as we always do. Hands washed the way line cooks do. Jackets and caps provided. No one crosses the pass without permission. The tone was gentle and firm. Helen agreed at once. Rick considered, and then said he would prefer to finish at the table, which in his language meant yes to my rules. Avery sent word that the station was ready. I stood and told Noah he had the floor. He answered with that small nod I trust. I walked to the host stand where Selena handed me the short form authorizing the ban across our locations. I read it in the clean light and signed. The pen felt heavier than it was. I thanked her again and asked her to brief Simone and Noah for their records. The air changed when I stepped into the kitchen. It always does. Steel and heat, and the hum of a room with a job. Avery met me at the pass with a spare jacket and a cap. She pointed me to the sink, and I scrubbed like the student I will always be in the kitchen. We tasted a winter garnish for the London fish, a tea-scented glaze with a line of bitter orange that laced the richness without stealing from it. I offered 3 words. She nodded once and said she had thought the same. The line cooks grinned and returned to their stations. Respect moved across the tile in quiet steps. I slipped back out to the dining room. Noah had kept my family at ease with coffee and the soft choreography of the last course. Helen smiled when she saw the jacket and cap in my hand, something like pride softening the corners of her mouth. Rick glanced at the signed form folded under my palm and did not flinch. Grant sat very still. His fingers found the cuffs again and turned them as if directing a complicated play no one else could see. The room shifted toward close in that familiar way. Voices lowered the door, breathed 2 more times, candles shortened themselves. I walked the floor with Simone and thanked the team by name. Philippe brought the night ledger to the sideboard, and I reviewed comps voids and the tip pool confirmation. My signature went where it needed to go. These are the small rituals that tell a staff they are seen. I returned to the table. I said that consequences have a clock. It starts now. I told Grant that I hoped he would use 6 months to think about what a dining room is and what it costs to make one feel like safety to the people who live in it for a living. He did not argue. He adjusted his cufflinks again, a tiny movement that looked more like echo than choice. Noah slipped the check to me in a leather folder. I signed and added the gratuity I had already requested, a number that matched the care I had watched all night. I closed the folder and set it aside. The hum of the room thinned toward silence. Chairs eased back. Coats returned to shoulders. Avery lifted a hand from the pass and I answered with mine. I stood and thanked my parents for coming, then told them Noah would walk them out when they were ready. He would make sure they had everything they needed. I would meet Avery for 5 minutes in the kitchen to finalize the garnish notes. We would end this evening the way good service ends, with details buttoned and voices low. Grant stared into the candle. The flame trembled and steadied. His fingers turned the cufflinks once more. Austin let out its late-night heat as I stepped from the valet into the elevator and rode to the top floor. The doors opened to my penthouse and the quiet that lives there. One long sweep of windows concrete, polished to a soft sheen, a sofa that does not call attention to itself, the kind of stillness that makes a person breathe deeper. I set my bag on the entry table and touched the framed article by the door. Early 2020, the headline had called Crown and Cedar a comeback story. The paper had browned a shade at the edges, but the ink held. I remembered the week we turned the lights back on, the way the dining room smelled of soap and hope, the way a first service after near closure feels like a heartbeat found again. I poured water and crossed to the long table where my laptop sat sleeping. The screen came alive to the month-end packet I had left open. October 2025. Oak and Ember now ran 34 restaurants across 3 continents, with about 2,100 employees. The trailing 12-month EBITDA sat at 24.5 million. The line charts did not spike or dive. They climbed with a patience I could feel in my chest. The ESOP rollout at 12% moved through its final approvals and training modules. Names on lists were turning into owners in small, clean steps, and that felt like a better headline than any article could write. I scrolled to the London report. Soft opening in March had given way to a steady season. The neighborhood board had extended winter noise conditions, and the team kept the room quiet enough that you could hear a laugh without hearing every word around it. I smiled at a photo from a staff meal where Avery had coached a young cook through a sauce that finally held. The Tokyo file sat next. The letter of intent from May neat signatures lined like a promise. Selena's notes on the master franchise draft red marks, where our veto would live a schedule for the next call with Kenji after the weekend. The work would slow where it needed to slow. Our name could afford patience. On the right side of the dashboard, a small folder held investor correspondence. Northbridge had sent its 12 times EBITDA offer back in July, and Jordan had logged our refusal with the same clarity he uses for payroll. The notes were brief. Cultural preservation prioritized. No further interest in sale at this time. Reading the words now felt like setting a weight down in the right place. I leaned back and let the room be what it is, all space and restraint, and the hum of a city far below. The night at Crown and Cedar replayed in fragments. Noah's steady hand. Simone's way of keeping policy gentle and firm. Selena's precise language. Philippe with his patient bottle. Avery with her jacket unbuttoned, heat on her cheeks from the line. My mother's fingers on the back of my hand. My father's small nod when a truth landed. My brother turned his cufflinks, an old habit that finally looked tired. I picked up my phone and opened the family thread. I typed a message and read it once before sending. Reservations follow policy. The waitlist sits at 3 months. There are no exceptions. My thumb tapped send, and the message left the screen without ceremony. It felt less like a boundary drawn at someone and more like a foundation poured under my own feet. I stood at the window and watched the city lift and settle. Somewhere down there, a server closed a sidework checklist and turned off a light. Somewhere, a cook tied a fresh bandana and went in for the night shift at a place that would never know my name. I thought of aprons and hands and the small aches that come from standing for a living. People talk about hospitality as if it were decoration. I know it as labor and grace, as muscle and memory. I respect the people who carry plates and heat and the dignity of a room. They are the point. I closed the laptop and set it aside. The penthouse felt the way a dining room feels after a good service, clean quiet. Nothing rattling that should not rattle. I turned off the living room lights and left the kitchen lights low and warm. The glow pooled on the counter like a promise. Soft justice is not a weaker version of the hard kind. It is the kind that knows when to lean and when to hold, that writes rules and then follows them, that keeps a house safe without raising its voice. Clear boundaries make space for tenderness. They let love be love and work be work. I thought of the women and men who had told me their stories at tables like mine. A mother who put 3 kids through school on tips and grit. A grandfather who taught his granddaughter to fold napkins square and told her to stand tall in her first jacket. A young manager wrote to me that he finally slept through the night because he trusted his floor again. These are my measures. This is my ledger. Before sleep, I opened the Notes app and wrote a few lines for the next staff meeting. Gratitude first. Training times posted with respect for school pickups and bus schedules. A reminder that we do not serve last names, we serve people. A welcome to the first cohort receiving ESOP certificates next month. I saved the file and felt the click inside myself that means tomorrow already has a shape. If my story found you at your own table tonight, I hope something true settled with you. Tell me about the boundary you drew that kept your dignity intact. Tell me about the moment you chose patience over noise and how it paid you back. Share the justice that felt soft and turned out to be strong. And if this kind of quiet strength is the company you want to keep, stay with me. There is always a next table, and when you are ready to sit, we will be ready to serve.